Hi everyone, it's Rachel here. Welcome to your second Flip Collaborate for EDU 8016 Literacy Across the Curriculum. This is your presentation for your own presentation, which is Assessment 1B, the presentation. This Flip Collaborate is relating to both the main unit people or non-specialization and the specialization. Again, there is just some differences in the word count and time limits, which I'll explain to you. When we have our interactive collab, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the expectations of the specialization. Let's get started. So really our ultimate goals for this assessment in terms of our own learning outcomes is to be able to critically analyse the teaching of literacy across the curriculum, and then we're also going to design effective communication with the use of media for specific purposes, which in a nutshell means that we're going to be preparing a presentation that we are going to deliver relating back to assessment number 1. In assessment number 1, which was our team presentation, it's really setting us up to now be able to go across and do this part of our assignment individually. So the teams are now disbanded. You don't need to contact those people to do assessment 1B. That is completely individual. But you can use the information and the knowledge that you've gained in assessment 1A to help you with this. So you'll actually need to go back to the scenario with Sean. You'll need to go back to what your team discussed in terms of what the issues were, what the literacy gaps were in terms of Sean and the inquiry unit that he wants to plan around solids, liquids and gases. That is still the same. But what we are now going to do, now that we've identified what the issues are, now that we've made some recommendations in terms of the 3D model, this is now where we go on to our own and we come to make some recommendations in terms of some practical, classroom-based strategies and activities that can be used by Sean and his team now. And you're going to present it as a video along with a complementary document, and I will explain that to you today as well. So number one thing that I think you need to do right now to get your mind ready for this presentation is to start to evaluate the literacy demands related to the scenario. So we are going back to this scenario again. So my first piece of advice is to look back at the situation with Sean again. Now we've only just had assessment 1A, so it's very fresh in our minds. All of the issues in our interactive collab, which you can go back and watch as a part of the recording, we actually highlighted parts of this case study and underlined things that we felt were pertinent, that were issues for both Sean and the team in terms of how we're really going to support and scaffold these kids to be able to have the literacy skills that they need to be able to then be successful with their science learning. Because at the end of the day, this is still a science unit. We are assessing to science outcomes, but the kids need to be literate to be able to complete the science unit. So you're going to have to go back. Have a look at what you discussed with your team. Have a look at what notes you've made for yourself. Have a look at that scenario again. And then you can think about what are the issues? What are the gaps? What are the things that Sean and the team are going to have to think about? Is it the fact that the kids have a limited vocabulary? They don't, or they're not aware of science-based vocab. They might struggle with some of the language. We talked in our interactive collab about the fact that kids might struggle with the words like molecules or atoms or reaction, change, solids, liquid, gas. They might have trouble with some of these things. So Sean's really going to need to put some effort into scaffolding the kids with some of this unfamiliar vocab in terms of decoding them and in terms of understanding them in context. Perhaps you can talk about the issues of limited knowledge, limited prior knowledge. You've very much talked about that in your assessment 1, the fact that the kids really do have limited prior knowledge. in terms of what they can bring to the table, what they can offer in terms of, it's really hard to be able to comprehend a text if you don't have enough insight into what some of these words mean, or you just have very limited understanding in your own lived experience that you can draw upon. We think about what we know about things like funds of knowledge. If we just don't have that schema there that we can sort of hang things on, it's very hard to learn new information. So how can Sean build up this prior knowledge? Rather than making kids do a reading about reaction and change, how can you sort of set them up for success by giving them some prior knowledge beforehand? There's many EALD kids in the grade. What impact is that going to have? What potential literacy gaps could there be there? And the kids also have limited experience with genres such as informational reports and procedures. What could we do about that? Now, these are just examples that I have pulled out of that case study. I'm sure there are many more, and you can use them to analyze as well. Now, this is starting to sound a hell of a lot like Assessment 1A, and I completely understand that. But again, you're just setting the scene. You're going to use a lot of the stuff that you've already got in Assessment 1A to do this. Now, please remember that because it's already been touched on and covered in Assessment 1A, please make this part brief. So we wouldn't want to use 2.5 minutes of a 3-minute presentation talking about this point 1, your literacy demands related to the scenario. Let's make it the shortest part of the 3 of the elements we have to cover. The 2 elements we have to cover. Let's make this the shorter part. Really just set the scene again. Tell us about Sean, tell us about the issues, to set the scene for part 2, which is where you're going to recommend some strategies. As I said, part 2 is to decide on a strategy that you feel addresses these issues or gaps. Now, in our rubric, it's asking us to look for very practical classroom-based examples. So you're going to have your issue that you've identified in the first part of your presentation, and then you're going to have your strategy, which is a classroom-based activity or task or an approach that you would like to use with the kids that could help with this issue. So now that we've isolated the fact that kids are limited in vocab, now that we've isolated the fact that kids have limited prior knowledge, what are we going to do about it? And this is going to be the main part of the 3 minutes, or the 5 minutes if you're doing specialization. We really want you to now use this time to explain to us that this is your recommended strategies. Now, I believe maybe in the 3 minutes, but most definitely in the 5 minutes, you'll probably be able to perhaps recommend a couple of things, and even touch on perhaps, say, 2 issues that you've identified as a literacy gap, and then what you're going to do about it. Now, you could be quite specific in what your classroom task is. Remember, it's for grade 3, so we know that we can make it particular to that particular grade level. But if you know there's just an approach that works for introducing prior knowledge to kids, then you can introduce a strategy, or yours might be a more practical classroom-based things like you're going to do a hands-on activity, you're going to use a word wall, you're going to use anchor charts. So like a practical thing from the classroom that we can suggest to Sean and his team. So on one part, you'll have your literacy gap or potential issue, and then on the other side, you'll be explaining to us how it's going to work in a practical classroom situation. Now, what we would like you to remember is that this video part of your Assessment 1B is quite informal. You need to imagine yourself presenting to a group of teachers. So we can really imagine ourselves doing that. We're sitting imagine someone was just looking at you in a staff meeting for 3 minutes and this is what you're going to say. So you wouldn't sit in a staff meeting and say, using the 3 resources model, I'm going to suggest this, or using Mazzano's 6 steps, I'm going to introduce this. We have to picture our video as more of an informal, this is the issues with Sean's grade, and these are the things that I think that we should do about it. You don't need to quote in your video and say things like, prior knowledge is limited in comprehension, Department of Education 2016. So try to make it sound like you're just having a discussion with people at school. Because in your complementary piece of writing that you are going to submit along with this is going to be where you show us how your recommendations link to theory. So they still have to be linked with theory, but you're just not going to be overly theory-based in when you present your ideas to us. They're more of a practical classroom. I'm sitting with Sean and I'm giving my ideas. You are going to film it with your camera facing us. It's not about a presentation with slides. This presentation is worth 20%. So I'm really going to stress to you now that I would like it to take up, 20% of your overall effort. It is meant to be a very short, easy, simple presentation. Most of part 1, which is again reiterating the literacy demands, can be taken from assessment 1, and then you've got to present your ideas about what you're going to do about it in a practical classroom sense, and you're just presenting to camera, and it should all be a very easy presentation to do. I'm really emphasizing the fact that we do need to put a lot of effort into our final assessment, so I'm really doing my best to try and keep this as absolutely as simple as possible. Reiterate what Sean's issues are in terms of literacy gaps with the grade, give some suggestions about what you're going to do about it, make a video presentation of you talking to the camera, and then submit your final summary document. For main unit people, this is going to be 300 words, but for specialization students, it is going to be 500 words. So you've got a little bit more room to show us a few more models as such. Now, this is where you're going to become more formal. So in your presentation, it's quite, I'm sitting around the classroom, I'm talking to colleagues, tone of voice. And this summary document is going to be where you then connect back to theory. So in this slide, I'll just skip back and show you. In this slide, we were talking about the fact that we've isolated some literacy gaps and we've made a recommendation. So if my recommendation was that students are going to watch a video about reaction and change prior to having to do a reading on comprehension, why am I doing that? What's the pedagogical approach? What's the theory behind me setting up my suggestion like that? So this is where we could link to things like teaching and learning cycle. So I might say that I really want the kids to be able to build field and build context prior to having to read any sort of text. So I might follow that teaching and learning cycle. I might take an inquiry approach. I might use something like Bloom's, something like Bloom's or the 5E model. So I have to have some sort of theoretical underpinnings or connections to models. There has to be a reason why you've chosen to do that. So if you're going to tell us in your suggestions in your video that you are going to be giving the kids a word wall or an anchor chart or a video or a song, why is it that you've chosen to do that? There has to be a reason. There has to be some sort of theoretical underpinning that supports what your suggestions are. Now again, they'll need to relate to each suggestion. I'm not quite sure how many practical activities you can mention in a 3/5 minute video. Obviously, specialization has a little bit more room to add some more in, or perhaps explain the two that they have in detail. But rather than having lots and lots of different suggestions, it's probably better off having 2 or 3 suggestions that you explain in a little bit more detail and a little bit more context, rather than many sounding like a really, really long list or something like that. So just to reiterate, you're going to go back to your assessment 1 and you're going to have a look at what those literacy gaps were and really try to choose some that you're going to isolate. In your video presentation, you'll talk about Sean and you'll reiterate the literacy demands and the gaps that you found in the classroom. And then you're going to give some practical examples, perhaps 2 or 3, depending on your word count or your minutes. And you're going to explain them like teachers explain them to each other. You don't need to have in-text references that you read out loud. You're just like colleagues talking and sharing of ideas. You're then going to submit your summary document of 300 words, and this is where you're going to get technical, and this is where you're going to show us your theoretical underpinnings of models and pedagogy that directly support the ideas that you stated in your video presentation to us. Your theoretical models that you choose should make sense and back up and support your reasons why you've chosen to have particular activities that you've given to the kids. Once you have your presentation, you'll upload that to Turnitin and SpeedGrader, and then you'll also submit your summary document as well. Now you will need to either use Studio, which can be found in the bottom left-hand corner of the toolbar in order to make a video. You can use a screencast. You can use your own webcam recording, whatever it is that you would like to use, and then you are going to submit that for us. We will talk more about presentation options, and we will talk more about some practical activities that align with the literacy demands of Sean's grade in our interactive collab. Just remember, this is worth 20%, guys, so we're just keeping it very simple. Good luck.